Hello, my friends. I hope that all is going well with all of you. And I am going to start my lecture presentation for Chapter 6. We just finished talking about energy. ATP is the thing that I want you to think of when you think of energy in living cells. The beginning of your text, the textbook talks about energy and its different uses. Talks about sprinters versus long distance runners, quick energy versus long-term energy. And the cells that require this energy are muscle cells. So in this little blurb in the front of your book, they talk about different types of muscle cells. Ones that can sustain you by holding you up for long periods of time, and ones that will allow you to run quick for short distances. These two types of muscle cells, or muscle fibers, are called slow twitch and fast twitch. Now, slow twitch are going to last longer. These are the guys that allow you to stand up for long periods of time or walk for long distances. They don't generate a lot of what we call quick power. They generate ATP using oxygen. When I make ATP using oxygen, that ATP, that energy molecule that we talked about in the last chapter, is going to last for longer periods of time. This ATP is more efficient for something that's going to be used over long periods of time. When I use oxygen to make that molecule in a big long chemical reaction we're going to talk about in this chapter, it will last longer than when I make that molecule just by tacking on another phosphate to an ADP. Again, we discussed that in the last chapter. By the way, when I use oxygen to make ATP, I make it aerobically. So you need to know that term. If I need to make ATP very quickly, and maybe I don't have as much oxygen as I should around, I can make it very quickly by just tacking on a phosphate to an ADP molecule, adenosine diphosphate, with some enzymes that I have hanging around in the cells. Those fast twitch fibers, the ones that allow for quick bursts very quickly, can use ATP that's generated without using oxygen. That's called anaerobically. Now these molecules serve the same purpose, but they don't last as long. So those fast twitch fibers can use them for their energy source. When we look at any given muscle group in a human, we're going to see a combination of fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. When I talk about skeletal muscle cell, muscle that moves our skeleton, the cells are very, very long, and they almost look like telephone poles under the microscope. That's why you see the term fibers referring to them in these slides. So when they say all human muscle contains both fibers, but in different ratios, they're referring to the different types of cells we find in any given muscle group. So it's important to understand energy flow and chemical cycling throughout our biosphere. Important to remember that we in this biosphere are very dependent on sunlight, and animals are very dependent on plants. The sunlight comes into play for our plants. As you know, we discussed somewhat the reaction of photosynthesis and understanding that sunlight is important to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars. So in this slide, when they refer to the chemical energy of sugars, they're referring to the energy that we can get from breaking down that C6H12O6 that glucose molecule that we talked about earlier. So the reaction of photosynthesis is a reaction that uses light energy from the sun to help make these sugar molecules, which we can then break down to make energy. So when we talk about different organisms in our biosphere, we talk about organisms that are either producers or consumers. Excuse me. Plants and other self-feeders or autotrophs, which is a term you should know as well, can make their own food using organic matter. So plants, for example, have roots that go down deep into the earth. They're going to bring up different building blocks from the earth through their roots, along with water, to help make the molecules they need to support themselves. Again, we call these organisms that can do this autotrophs or self-feeders. You, on the other hand, and other animals can't take organic molecules from the earth and build what they need. So they have to rely on plants or autotrophs for their nutrients. We call us and other animals heterotrophs because we have to eat these organic molecules or consume them in order to make the ones that we need to survive. So animals, including humans, are heterotrophs. They need to eat other things like plants who are autotrophs in order to survive. Autotrophs are also called producers because they're the ones that produce the food in any given ecosystem. Another name for the heterotrophs is a consumer because they are going to consume the producers. So autotrophs and producers are sort of synonym, and heterotrophs and consumers are sort of synonym. The next part of the book talks about the cycle we see with respect to chemistry and energy in our ecosystems. In order for plants or producers or autotrophs to make the molecules they need carbon dioxide and water from the environment to do that. Plants are able to get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're also able to get water from the environment they live in through their roots and damp soil. They can actually get some of it from the atmosphere, the air, but most of it is going to be obtained from their roots and the ground. The other thing that these guys need are a place within the cells to make the glucose molecules. Those are called chloroplasts, and we talked a little bit about those in the last chapter. We see them inside the cells of plants or autotrophs or producers. And the chemicals within the chloroplasts are going to help with the help of light energy to rearrange carbon dioxide and water to make glucose. They can also use this chemical bag of chemicals to make other organic molecules. And one of the things they also produce, which is actually a waste product of their chemistry, is oxygen gas. That's going to be important for animals. So plants and animals both perform the next type of reaction within their cells, taking those sugars, breaking them down through a big, huge reaction called cellular respiration that takes place in the mitochondria, that's going to take those sugars that were produced with the use of oxygen and generate ATP. Cellular respiration happens in both plants and animals, and cellular respiration is the reaction that produces the ATP molecule. In animals, the waste products of cellular respiration are carbon dioxide and water. And guess who's going to use carbon dioxide and water for photosynthesis? The producers. So animals perform only cellular respiration. Plants have the ability to do both. And plants usually make up organic molecules that they can use for fuel. That's why, again, that term autotrophs comes in. They have the ability to make their own food and then break it down to make their own energy. We use that to make our energy. We can only have that one step, cellular respiration. In the plant, that extra material is going to be used to help the plant grow, and it's also going to help the plant store energy for itself. So when we look at plants such as potatoes, for example, starch in potatoes is actually used by the potato for energy. It's stored glucose molecules. So in this diagram on page 93 in your textbook, we see the cycle of energy that goes through our ecosystems. Photosynthesis in the autotrophs or producers is very important to make that sugar molecule, and that sugar molecule, when it is produced, and the oxygen that is then released into the environment, is going to help animals carry on cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, again, also takes place in plants, but cellular respiration is the only thing that can happen in animals. So we need to consume plants either directly or indirectly in order to get the glucose molecules we need for the process of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is going to make the energy we need to drive our reactions of metabolism. And basically, metabolism is all the chemistry that takes place in living organisms. So cellular respiration is the main way the chemical energy is harvested from food and converted to ATP. It's a big, huge chemical reaction. Don't let it intimidate you, because it's going to talk about a lot of the specifics of this reaction. But basically, I want you to know the overall general input and output of this reaction for our purposes. In the reaction, the big, huge series of reactions of cellular respiration, there's two major portions to the reaction. It begins with taking glucose molecules, simple sugars, and starting to break them apart chemically. I can do that without oxygen in the beginning of this reaction. And when I do anything without oxygen, that's anaerobic. When I need oxygen in order for this to happen, that's called aerobic. So we're going to see cellular respiration on the whole involves both anaerobic and aerobic processes. But the term cellular respiration refers to the fact that we do need oxygen for this to take place, at least to fully take place efficiently and get the most ATP we can out of the reaction. So cellular respiration is typically defined as an aerobic process requiring oxygen to take place. Cellular respiration and breathing, and that's why we see that respiration term in there, makes us think of breathing, are very closely related. Because in order for cellular respiration to take place, we need to have an exchange of gases within the cell. In order for you to breathe, the process of breathing is an exchange of gases between the outside environment and your internal cells. So the term respiration goes with both these processes hand in hand. We need to breathe gases from the atmosphere into our lungs so that gas exchange can take place, so we can get oxygen to cells like our muscle cells and get rid of waste gases like carbon dioxide. So when we breathe in, we take in the oxygen, and some of that goes into gas exchange, our circulatory system. It's then taken to the muscle cells where the process, that chemical process of cellular respiration takes place. And then one of the waste products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide, is then picked up by our circulatory system and brought back to the lungs for more gas exchange, and we can breathe out carbon dioxide. So one of the things you have to remember is the simple equation for cellular respiration. This is where we take glucose and oxygen and we create waste products, carbon dioxide and water. And the biggest, most important result of this reaction, ATP. For every given glucose molecule, if put into this reaction of cellular respiration, we can create a great deal of ATP as long as oxygen is present. 32, 36, 38 are some of the numbers you'll see in textbooks with respect to the product of cellular respiration. Your textbook happens to quote 32 ATP molecules for each glucose molecule. So if I, just like in a factory, take a glucose molecule and combine it with oxygen within the cells, the result again is carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So this is the basic reaction of cellular respiration. Hydrogen, electrons from hydrogen are going to help break down sugars with the help of oxygen to form the products of cellular respiration. Two different reactions are going to take place to manipulate this glucose molecule within the cellular factory. It's a combination of two types of reactions where we're going to be transferring electrons from one substance to another. The two terms are oxidation and reduction reactions. And because they take place hand in hand together, we call them redox reactions for short. So an oxidation reaction takes place when atoms or molecules come together and they lose electrons. Reduction reactions take place when atoms or molecules react with each other and they actually gain electrons. So now you can see why these two sort of go hand in hand. Because when an oxidation reaction happens and an electron is lost, that lost electron is then taken up during a reduction reaction. So when we look at the reaction, the total reaction of cellular respiration, we see that glucose molecules are oxidized and oxygen is reduced. And we see that redox reaction, the coupling of oxidation and reduction reactions, makes a lot of sense because it makes two groups of molecules happy. And remember, when we talked about molecules being happy, we talked about the fact that we have to have those nice outer shells, valence electrons, full in order for the molecule to be stable. So the two reactions taking place together create stable molecules within the cell. So remember, glucose loses electrons, therefore is oxidized, and oxygen gains electrons and is therefore reduced. So when electrons move from glucose to oxygen, we call this electron falling. And that fall of electrons is going to release energy during the reaction of cellular respiration. So it's sort of like you going down a waterfall, moving down. A couple of terms you should remember from the previous chapter is entropy. That controlled fall of electrons is like sort of going down a staircase or a waterfall. The release of heat energy is the result from this reaction. Another very important molecule that's important in the reaction of cellular respiration is a couple of molecules that are actually going to help pick up and transport electrons when they are lost and bring them so that other reactions can take place. So in this slide, they talk about one of those electron carriers. NAD, good enough. It's a big, huge, long name, but as long as you remember NAD, I will be happy. It's going to help carry these electrons to the places needed so that we can build lots of ATP from the energy used from that falling of electrons. We call this portion of that big, huge reaction, cellular respiration, the electron transport chain. So NAD is going to grab onto electrons, and we see them in the form of hydrogen ions, and bring them to this reaction, sort of the falling down the waterfall, to help with a series of redox reactions that are going to result in lots and lots of ATP being produced. So we see in this diagram here, and that's in your textbook on page 95, those NAD electron carriers bonding with free electrons and bringing them to this series of reactions. And these are little proteins. You see the little purple electron transport chain circles in that diagram? These are actually little proteins within the mitochondrial membranes. And when those electrons are transported to these little proteins, the little proteins are going to run through, or electrons, excuse me, are going to run through these little protein pumps. That's going to produce lots and lots of energy. And that's why we refer to the mitochondria as our power source, or our place where we make lots of ATP within the cell. So, when we look at the reaction of cellular respiration, it's a metabolic pathway. It's a series of chemical reactions. And there's three main stages in this big, huge series of chemical reactions. The first one is called glycolysis, and this is where we break down glucose, glycolysis. The second part of the reaction is called the citric acid cycle. Another name for it is the Krebs cycle. And then the third part of the reaction is called the electron transport chain. And this is where the little electron carriers that we actually generate in the reactions number 1 and reactions number 2 are going to take electrons and bring them to this part of the reaction to produce lots and lots of ATP. So what we need to understand about cellular respiration is that these three reactions are involved, and then we have to have a little bit of a basic understanding of what these reactions are actually doing. All right, that's not going to work. I got to go and open that up. So hold on one sec. I'm going to open this right up, and we are going to watch a little video. Or maybe we're not. Gotta love modern technology, you know? Let's go this way. There we go.
As this mountain biker heads up the trail, the breakfast he ate this morning is being burned to power his bike ride. His breathing rate increases as his leg muscles demand more oxygen to burn more fuel. Let's zoom down to where this fuel is burned, our cells. Here, the blood vessel on the left delivers fuel and oxygen to a single muscle cell. In cellular respiration, energy in fuel is converted to ATP, shown here as starbursts. Most ATP is made in the cell's mitochondria. ATP powers the work of the cell, such as contraction. Let's take a closer look at how ATP is produced from a molecule of glucose, our fuel. Only the carbon skeleton is shown to keep things simple. The first step is called glycolysis, and it takes place outside the mitochondria. To begin the process, some energy has to be invested. Next, the molecule is split in half. Now, the molecule NAD+, an electron carrier, picks up electrons and hydrogen atoms from the carbon molecule, becoming NADH. Keep track of the electron carriers. They play an important role by transporting electrons to reactions in the mitochondria. In the final steps of glycolysis, some ATP is produced, but not much. For every glucose molecule, only 2 net ATPs are produced outside the mitochondrion. However, glycolysis has produced pyruvic acid, which still has a lot of energy available. Let's follow this pyruvic acid molecule into a mitochondrion to see where most of the energy is extracted. As the molecule enters the mitochondrion, 1 carbon is removed, forming carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Electrons are stripped, forming NADH. Coenzyme A attaches to the 2-carbon fragment, forming acetyl-CoA. Coenzyme A is removed, and the remaining 2-carbon skeleton is attached to an existing 4-carbon molecule that serves as the starting point for the citric acid cycle. The new 6-carbon chain is partially broken down, releasing carbon dioxide. Several electrons are captured by electron carriers, and more carbon dioxide is released. The carbon dioxide that you exhale comes from the reactions of cellular respiration. 2 ATPs are produced by the citric acid cycle for each molecule of glucose. At this point, only a small number of ATPs have been produced. However, more energy is available in the electrons that are being transported by electron carriers. While the citric acid cycle starts another round, let's follow an electron carrier to the next step in the process. Electron carriers such as NADH deliver their electrons to an electron transport chain embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. The chain consists of a series of electron carriers, most of which are proteins that exist in large complexes. Electrons are transferred from one electron carrier to the next in the electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look at the path electrons take through the chain. As electrons move along each step of the chain, they give up a bit of energy. The oxygen you breathe pulls electrons from the transport chain, and water is formed as a byproduct. The energy released by electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, across the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, creating an area of high hydrogen ion concentration. Hydrogen ions flow back across the membrane through a turbine. Much like water through a dam, the flow of hydrogen ions spins the turbine, which activates the production of ATP. These spinning turbines in your cells produce most of the ATP that is generated from the food you eat. The process you've just observed, cellular respiration, generates 10 million ATPs per second in just one cell. That ATP can power a biker up the trail, or it can power your brain cells as you learn challenging biology topics.
So, the nice thing is, if you don't quite get it, that's sort of the basis of cellular respiration. Now, in our slideshow, this is the basis of the reaction of cellular respiration. for our purposes, I just want you to understand the three parts and a little bit about the input and the output you're going to get from each of these reactions. Again, the three major reactions are glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Where do these take place in cells? Most of the reaction, the citric acid and electron transport chain, takes place within the membranes of the mitochondria. The beginning part of the reaction, glycolysis, that creates molecules called pyruvic acid, are then going to be used for the next two parts of the reaction. And that can take place within the cytoplasm of the cells. So the big picture, those three stages of cellular respiration, the book then goes on to examine in more detail. Again, I don't want you to panic because I don't want you to know every single 3-carbon molecule that's produced. I want you to just remember what cellular respiration is, and I want you to remember some of the input and the output of each of the reactions. So when we talk about glycolysis, we're talking about taking a glucose molecule, a 6-carbon glucose molecule. And at the end of the reaction, we're going to produce 2 molecules called pyruvic acid. Now these 2 molecules are going to be extremely important because they are going to donate electrons, and we're also in the process going to make some of these electron carriers. Remember, we already met one of them. One of them is called NAD. I hope you noticed in the little BioSPHERE movie that those little electron carriers came in 2 forms. One was green and one was orange, because there's actually 2 molecules that are going to serve the same purpose. Again, the first one we're meeting is NAD. There's also an electron carrier molecule we're going to make in the next step of cellular respiration, and it's called FAD. Both of them are going to serve the same purpose. Now this slide might make you very nervous. Remember, what I want you to remember is the input and the output of each of these reactions. The middle part is the steps that get us to the end. I'm not going to make you memorize that, but I just want you to get an appreciation for the fact that it's a very complex series of chemical reactions. In the process of breaking glucose down in glycolysis, we are going to make a little bit of energy. We're going to use some of that energy, so that's why we only get a little bit at the end. But the really important molecule we're going to need from this part of the reaction is the pyruvic acid that we make. The other very important player is NAD, and that is going to help transport some of the electrons that are freed up by the chemistry that goes on. So remember, glycolysis is taking glucose, the input, and breaking it down to give us pyruvic acid, a little bit of ATP, and those electron carriers, NAD. So we're only going to get 2 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule because we actually make 4, but we use 2. With the help of enzymes, we're going to help make ATP in this reaction. And we see this little picture in your textbook on page 97. So once we have those pyruvic acid molecules, we're then going to take them and feed them into the next part of the reaction. So the whole reaction, think of it as sort of a little factory where certain parts of the factory will make certain things that other parts of the factory need to produce their product. The second part of the reaction is called the citric acid cycle. And in the citric acid cycle, we're going to take those pyruvic acid molecules that were made in glycolysis, and we're then going to put them through a series of chemical reactions as well. So we're going to get some carbon dioxide out of this portion of the reaction, and we're also going to generate some more of those NADs. In the beginning part of the reaction, we start to alter that pyruvic acid molecule. We're going to make a molecule called acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl CoA. This molecule is then going to start a series of chemical reactions that we call the citric acid cycle. Again, this is one of those input-output, a lot of stuff going on in between. But remember, I want you to remember from this reaction the input and the output. This is the beginning part of the citric acid cycle, which will start once we form acetyl coenzyme A. So we take pyruvic acid and we alter it. With the help of NAD, we're going to pick up some of the electrons that were released when we alter pyruvic acid. And the end result here is acetyl coenzyme A, CoA. That molecule is then going to feed into the citric acid cycle. So this is sort of an in-between step between glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. Part 2 of the citric acid cycle is then going to take acetyl coenzyme A and start to alter it as well. Within this reaction, we are going to alter a molecule. We're going to make a couple more ATPs, but we're going to form FAD and NAD. Remember, these two guys are our electron carriers. So that's why you see it in your slide written as NADH and FADH2. Oops, sorry about that. So this is one of those cute little things, blast animations. Just watch closely and see how we step through this reaction. Again, I'm not going to make you memorize this. I just want you to get a feel for what's going on and why each of these molecules is important in the total picture of cellular respiration. When I had to take biochemistry way back when, I had to learn all of these different reactions in order. I'm not going to make you do that. When you take biochemistry, you'll have to learn this all over again. Again, what I want you to do is get an appreciation for how complex the chemistry actually is. But for our purposes, we're going to remember the input and the output. And again, the big output that we need to remember from this reaction is we get a few ATPs, and we can see that down here in this box. The big important part of this reaction is those electron carriers, NAD and FAD. Carbon dioxide is a waste product, and in animals, we're going to get rid of that carbon dioxide when we breathe out. In plants, we're going to actually recycle that carbon dioxide and use it for photosynthesis. So in this slide, we see that general information, and you can see that in your textbook on page 98. Remember, the input of citric acid cycle is going to be acetyl coenzyme A, that acetic acid we see written here, and the output is going to be a little bit of ATP, but those really important NADs and FADs. Remember from this reaction, the input and output. The last part of the reaction is where we make sort of the mother load of ATP. And this is where those electron carriers, NAD and FAD, that we made in the previous two reactions are going to take their electrons and dump them off. They're going to dump them off so that they fall in the electron falling that we described before to create enough energy to create energy molecules like ATP. We call this the electron transport chain. Another name for it is oxidative phosphorylation. And basically what that means is with the help of oxygen in these reactions, I'm going to take a phosphate and tack it on to the ADP molecule. That's phosphorylation. So we're going to use the energy that's released by the fall of electrons through those little protein pumps that we find in the inner mitochondrial membrane to harvest energy to make energy. So use these ions in stored energy potential. Kind of take the potential energy and make energy with it, if that makes sense. When hydrogen ions start to flow down the steps, that's going to help us make ATP. We can take those phosphates and tack them onto ADP with the help of enzymes, ATP synthase. And that's going to take the energy from the flow of electrons down those stairs and make ATP for us. So we can see this diagram, which is in your textbook on page 99. And we can see the electrons in the form of hydrogen ions that were brought into the reaction by NAD and carried to the next part of the reaction by FAD. That hydrogen ion pump at the end is our ATP synthase, and this is where we're going to take that energy from the electrons falling down those stairs to tack phosphate molecules onto ADP, making adenosine diphosphate into adenosine triphosphate. Now, if I have a hard time doing this because things have been disrupted chemically, I'm not going to be able to make enough energy to survive. They give us a little blurb in your textbook about cyanide and why it's a deadly poison. Cyanide is going to bind to some of those protein complexes in the electron transport chain. It's going to prevent the passage of electrons to oxygen, and that's going to stop the production of ATP. If I can't make enough ATP, I can't drive the reactions of metabolism inside my cells, and that's why cyanide is such a deadly poison. Again, the results of cellular respiration, according to your textbook, is about 32 molecules of ATP. So every time I shoot a glucose molecule through this series of chemical reactions, I make 32 ATPs. Remember, this is the general information we need to remember from what cellular respiration is. Glycolysis, which forms acetyl coenzyme A, which then feeds into the citric acid cycle, which then falls down the electron transport chain to make about 32 ATPs total. 28 from the electron transport chain, 2 of them result from the citric acid cycle, and 2 of them result from glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis doesn't require oxygen to take place. That is the anaerobic portion of the reaction. The other 2 parts of the reaction require oxygen: citric acid cycle, electron transport chain. Those are the aerobic portions of the reaction. We see this diagram in your textbook on page 100. So, cellular respiration can break down many different types of carbohydrates, but we can also break down other molecules to feed into this reaction. We can use fats, triglycerides, and proteins, which are made of amino acids, to also create energy. In your textbook on page 100, we see this diagram. So basically, we can use different components of these other molecules to make some of the building blocks of the reaction as it goes through its 3 steps. So with fats, I can use glycerol and fatty acid in different parts of the reaction. With proteins, I can use amino acids in different portions of the reaction as well. The most efficient thing to use is carbohydrates or polysaccharides or sugars, but I can also use the others in this reaction as well. The book talks a little bit about fermentation, and fermentation takes place anaerobically without oxygen. We can harvest energy from fermentation, and some cells can harvest energy from fermentation as well. When we talk about yeast and bacteria, this is the type of cellular respiration that they use. We don't call it cellular respiration, though, because there's no oxygen involved. So this is the anaerobic form without oxygen to harvest energy from food. Remember, we can do this part 2, that's glycolysis. It doesn't require oxygen. It doesn't produce a lot of energy, though. It only produces a couple of ATP molecules. But we can use it in a pinch when there's not a lot of oxygen around. Pyruvic acid produced by glycolysis is going to also produce those NADs to keep glycolysis going. And one of the things that happens in this reaction is we produce a waste product called lactic acid. If too much
All cells are able to synthesize ATP via the process of glycolysis. In many cells, if oxygen is not present, pyruvate is metabolized in a process called fermentation. By oxidizing the NADH produced in glycolysis, fermentation regenerates NAD+, which can take part in glycolysis once again to produce more ATP. The net energy gain in fermentation is 2 ATP molecules per molecule of glucose. Fermentation complements glycolysis and makes it possible for ATP to be continually produced in the absence of oxygen. There are 2 types of fermentation. Alcohol fermentation, which occurs in yeast, results in the production of ethanol and carbon dioxide. Lactic acid fermentation, which occurs in muscle, results in the production of lactate.
So we see that other organisms can use this form of energy production. Humans also use it, but it can build up some waste products. And that waste products can cause some problems. Too many of them can cause problems in humans. This fellow who's running a marathon is a good example, because when we use up a lot of our oxygen, because we're undergoing this reaction so quickly, we rely on glycolysis, anaerobic respiration for our energy when we run out. Unfortunately, that lactic acid output can cause problems like cramping in our muscle cells. So muscles produce lactic acid under anaerobic conditions. Does the buildup of lactic acid cause muscle fatigue, is the question. Hypothesis: the buildup of lactic acid would cause muscle activity to stop. We can do this experiment on frog muscles. If you look in your textbook, you can see this reaction going on page 102 in your textbook. So, results: when lactic acid could diffuse away, the muscles were able to perform normally. And when lactic acid accumulated, the muscles couldn't contract properly. What happened is they stayed contracted and didn't relax. However, recent evidence suggests that the role of lactic acid in muscle function still remains unclear. Fermentation alone is able to sustain many different types of microorganisms. Notice it says microorganisms. These are small cells. They don't need as much energy as multicellular complex organisms do. So we see this type of energy production in smaller organisms. The result: microbes can be used to make different products for us as well. And we've harvested the ability to make things like cheese and sour cream and yogurt using the fermentation process in microorganisms. If you've ever made bread, you use the fermentation process, and the gases produced as a waste product of fermentation cause your bread to rise. Yeast is used to make bread. Alcoholic fermentation: we can take the alcohol that's produced from the fermentation process and harvest things like beer and wine. Again, bread is also a result of that as well. This is the chemistry involved. Input: glucose, fermentation process takes place, and the output is ethyl alcohol. So there is some alcohol production in the fermentation that causes your bread to rise as well. When little oxygen was available, and this is the evolutionary connection, we saw that fermentation was the way that ancient organisms created energy. Glycolysis occurs in most all organisms, complex and simple, and we call it the metabolic heirloom of the first stage in the breakdown of organic molecules. So if we look at the evolutionary tree, the origins or the beginnings of the Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, we see our oldest prokaryotic fossils, 3.5 billion years ago. And remember, prokaryotes are the simpler celled organisms. And then we start to see oxygen in the atmosphere around 2.7 billion years ago. And the first eukaryotic organism coming into play 2.1 billion years ago. Remember the basic reaction. This you need to know. Glycolysis, which forms acetyl coenzyme A, which feeds into the citric acid cycle, and then electron transport chain. This diagram you should know well. Okay, my friends, we are done. I will see you all on Wednesday. Please be sure to take your quiz. I will extend this quiz and have it due on Monday of next week. So you can have a couple of days off if you want. I will see you all in class on Wednesday. Take care. Have a great weekend.